So we're continuing on with our series, this question and answer series, and talking about all of these big questions about faith that people on the outside looking in have about faith. People who are skeptical, people who are atheists, people who are agnostic, people who are searching, people who are seeking. They have these kinds of big questions, but these are also questions that people of faith have as well, things that we wonder, things that we struggle through. And now we've been saying at the beginning of every message that we do is we talk about the two reasons why we're actually going on this journey together. And the first of those is that a lot of these big questions, people have been drawn to faith because they found that Christianity provides the best, sufficient, and coherent answer to these deep questions that we have. So they're drawn towards faith. But then on the flip side, what we find is that people are pushed away from faith because of these questions. And it's not necessarily that they find that Christianity is insufficient, is that they find that their questions aren't welcome. They find that their questions are shunned, right? Or they're told that, you can't question God, that the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it kind of mentality, and we're just supposed to take it like it is. I never question God. And so these people, because they feel their questions aren't welcome or they're given terrible answers for their questions, that they're actually pushed away from faith. And so that's the basis for why we've been going through this entire series, is to really see how Christianity does provide a sufficient answer to all of these questions that we're talking about. And so now to get into what we're talking about today, I want to talk about rivalries. And so I'm sure you could probably think in your life, think about bigger picture in our world, where you find people or teams or things that are sort of put against each other. They're always against each other, and it's always a big fanfare sort of thing that people want to see these two teams or these two people go head to head. Now I remember when I was in high school, when I played tennis, so it's a little known fact about me that I played tennis in high school, and I was a pretty decent player. And there was a rivalry that I had in high school. There was always this one team that me and my doubles partner always played, and sometimes they would win, sometimes we would win, and it always would draw a crowd because we were usually the last match to go. We would end up going into the night a very long time because just the match would just go on forever. And so we would kind of have this back and forth, and this was this rivalry that was known in sort of in our high school of this other team that we would always play. But now you look at our world and you find that there are other rivalries, other things that are always against each other. One's better than the other. You always got to choose sides. These particular things that we find in our world. And so maybe you're part of the Coke versus Dr. Pepper sort of rivalry. Now in Texas, Dr. Pepper is the drink to drink. You go to a restaurant and you ask for Dr. Pepper, and the server says, well, we just have Coke, or we have Pepsi. And it's like, well, that's not the same thing. Or maybe you're a Coke person and you're like, well, I go to a restaurant and they say, well, we have this Dr. Pepper. Like, no, that's not the same thing. And so it's either one or the other, right? You got to take a side. Or think about McDonald's versus Burger King, right? Which one has the best burger? In recent years, both of them came out with a 100% beef burger or something like that, and which makes you a little kind of scared of what was in their burgers beforehand, and now they're just now coming out with the burgers that are actually 100% like real beef. And so there's this tension there between McDonald's and Burger King. One of them is better than the other. Or you think of sports teams, especially here in Kentucky, and I don't know wherever you're watching this from or listening to it from, is that we find that there are sports teams that are always against each other. Here in Kentucky, it's always the University of Kentucky versus Louisville, usually in basketball, maybe sometimes in football, but I think for the most part in basketball. Maybe University of Kentucky and Duke, usually a rivalry there as well. I'm not a sports guy, but I assume this is kind of where the rivalries are. And so no matter how we look at our world, there's always things that seem that are always going against each other. Right? And you got to pick one or the other. Right? It's not a both and sort of thing. So we're told you got to pick one team, or you're not really on anybody's side. It's really a sad thing when you say you watch a football game and you ask somebody, who are you going for? Well, I could go for either one. Well, that's not a satisfying answer, right? You got to pick one or the other, right? It's not a both and. Now we see this similar thing, a similar idea when we come over to faith. And then when we come over to faith, what we find is that faith is normally pitted against, or versus science. That's usually the contention that we find, and whether it's true or not, and we're going to see that as we kind of go along here. And sometimes people will put this in a very demeaning sort of way. Sometimes they'll say it's faith versus fact. meaning that there's something wrong with faith and how it's incompatible with science, or we see it the other way around, that there's something wrong with science, that it's somehow incompatible with faith. And now the thinking, the way it goes, is like this. And so people will ask the question, right? The way they think about this is that does science disprove Christianity? Right? This is one of the main questions that a lot of people have, especially they're skeptical, they're agnostic or atheist. These are the questions that are on their mind when they talk about faith, right? So does science itself disprove Christianity? And again, the thinking continues on. So why they ask that question is that because science has been said to be called a truth-based sort of discipline. And so because it's truth-based, we got to look at faith. And so faith is then filled with a lot of factual inaccuracies or factual errors. Right? So again, this is the way that thinking goes in our culture. People will say that science is evidence-based, and I don't disagree with that. Right? This is science is a discipline that observes the natural world. Right? The natural order of things, the scientific method, all of these other scientific sort of things that we learned in school and we continue to see in our world. And so it's evidence-based. But then people who hold to science as their ultimate worldview will say, well, faith then is just wishful thinking. Because with faith, you can't observe something in the natural world, you can't run it through the scientific method, that it is all just wishful thinking. There's nothing to be grounded in, right? There's no facts or evidence to ground yourself in. And so these same people who take science as their complete worldview say that science points us forward. That it is all about all these technological advances, that we're moving forward, we're progressing humanity forward one step at a time, but that faith looks back. That we are so consumed by old books, old religious practices that are taking us back kind of to the Stone Age, right? These sort of archaic practices. And so these are the mentalities that people have when they really ask that question of really if the science actually disprove Christianity. But I wonder, like, why would people think like this? And maybe this is a question for you, and so maybe this is something you've got to really think about. It's like, why it is that you have this opinion or this question of science actually disproves Christianity? And I think there's two reasons why I think we see this as a prevalent question in our culture, is that it's just the way we think and the way culture wants us to think. So the way we tend to think right now, at least in our current culture, is we tend to think through sound bites and memes. We hear some part of an interview and we make it out to be something that it was never intended to be. If you watch CNN or Fox News, and this is not to get political or anything, they'll take a sound bite from somebody who said something, whether it was a president, whether it was some other political official, and they make them say something that they were not intending to say. They take it completely out of context to sort of get a story. And so that's why a lot of people can't trust the news these days, because there's a lot of just lies that are kind of coming out there because they're making something out to be something that it's not. And so because the way we think is through sound bites and memes, we take it and run with it. So when I say, oh, did you hear that such and such said this? And it's like, oh yeah, I did hear that. But we don't know the whole story. We don't know the whole picture. And then when it comes to faith, when it comes to science, we might hear something an atheist says. And they might say, well, science does disprove Christianity. And we're like, man, my faith is completely wrecked because that person said that. Right? And they have some sort of evidence that says that, but we've never actually searched for it ourselves. Right? Done the searching and seeking on our own to determine whether or not what that person is saying is actually true. So we go based on sound bites and memes, right? Some picture tells us that this is the truth, or these are facts, and we run with it. So the way that we think, I think, creates this tension. And then the way culture wants us to think. No matter what culture you are raised in, no matter what time period you've grown up in, right, whatever decade you've grown up in, the culture puts pressure on us to believe what it wants us to believe. There might have been things several decades ago that were the majority opinion, but now have maybe become the minority opinion. And I don't have a particular issue in mind, but you can clearly see how things change with the time. Culture wants us to think a certain way, and so when it comes to faith, maybe the culture tells us it's not a popular thing to be a person of faith, and so maybe we don't engage in faith at all. Or, it tells us that we should throw God out of the conversation altogether, like God has no place in science, God has no place in philosophy, God has no place in public discourse, so we throw it all out together. And I think our culture has sort of adopted this idea of what we call secularism. And secularism, it's a big word, but here's what it means. It's that because there is no God, so this is coming from the opinion of someone who says there's no God and no spiritual reality in the universe beyond what we can test. So this is taking science as a complete and total worldview, or naturalism. Spiritual matters should be removed from public life and conversation. So this is born out of the idea that faith, right, disproves science, or faith has been disproven by science, and that science holds the answer for everything. Now, if you remember, we went through these categories last time about origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And so people who hold science as their ultimate worldview, right, taking God out of the picture altogether, they have to use science to then answer each and every one of these questions. Right? These really, a lot and deeply, are existential questions. It's interesting, when you think about a lot of the questions that we have and compare it to a questions that a child has. Now, a child has questions that are very genuine. Right? So if you have kids or you had young kids, they all have questions. And a lot of the questions they ask, again, are very genuine. Sometimes they're really kind of interesting. Our daughter asked us the other day, when you die, am I going to get new parents? And we're like, well, no, we're always going to be your parents, right? You're never going to not be our daughter, right? You will always be that. We'll always be your mom and dad. And then sometimes they ask very deep questions, right? Questions about meaning, questions about worth and value, like why, those kind of why questions. And they may not ask those maybe verbally, but these are things I think they're discovering as they kind of go along. And this is not to demean science as a complete worldview. I'm a firm believer in science, and I'm sure you are a believer in science as well. So when I talk about science, I don't mean it, just in the way we observe the world, but I mean science as a complete worldview. And I think science as a complete worldview can answer the existential questions of life. Science can answer for us maybe what we are, our chemical components, maybe able to answer a little bit about where we came from, how we came to be, but it's not going to be able to answer why. Like why we are. Like, well, what's our purpose? What's the meaning behind our life? What's the goal of life? Or maybe who we are. It can't answer those questions. So it's a little inadequate, and it's a little, I think, difficult for us to try to put all our eggs in this one basket of science and say that's going to be the be-all, end-all, that's going to answer every heart-wrenching question that we have. But I think what we find as we go through this entire process and this whole discussion today is that we find that science and faith actually go hand in hand. Because there are some things that Christianity can't answer. Yeah, it cannot answer what our chemical makeup is. It may not be able to give us those scientific views of the world. It may not tell us how it is we came to be, maybe a process in which we came to be who we are today. It's not going to be able to answer that question for us. But science can. Science can't answer the why questions, but faith is able to answer those questions. And so what we find is if we take this journey seriously, they actually go well together. That we need both of them to give us a complete picture of who God has made us to be, of who God has made this universe to be. Now, if we look at the scriptures, we look at the Bible, what we find is that there are verses throughout the Bible that really give us a clue into its perspective on creation, its perspective on how we work, what's our creative sort of background, what is God's creative hand in all of these kinds of things. It really addresses all of this, and again, it has its limits, as we'll talk about as we kind of go through the rest of the message. And so if we go to Genesis chapter 1, one of the most contentious verses of the Bible, in the beginning, God created. Now already, we would have a big argument or big disagreement with people who are maybe agnostic or skeptical or have this question of whether or not science has actually disproven faith. Because we're already making the claim here that in the beginning, God created the world. And for some, that's really hard to understand. It's hard for me to understand how he went about doing that. It's hard for a lot of people to reconcile because there's a lot of other things in science that they would rather believe than to just say that God actually did it. But the Bible takes this firm stance. It's not telling us how this happened. It's not telling us like what we're actually made out of. But it's saying, in the beginning, God. Like the actor behind all of this, that God created the heavens and the earth. And this is a theme that goes through the entire Bible. Now, we can't cite every verse that there is to cite about this particular issue or this particular topic. But we find, like in Psalm 19, verse 1, it says that the heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of his hand. So the psalmist believed that you look around all of us and you can see everything that's been created. And we have to conclude that somebody outside of us did it, right? Because of its intricacies, because of its majesty. Someone had to design it. And for the psalmist, in Psalm 19:1, he says God is the one who did it. And this even goes down into Romans 1:20. This is Paul, the Apostle Paul, talking about all of this. And he says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." So again, this theme goes on even to the New Testament, where Paul says, look, everyone should be able to look around us, and when they meet God, they're going to be without excuse, because the only thing you can say about everything that's been created is that God did it. Right? And then God is revealing himself through nature, through all these things around us, the things that he's created, and I think even us, right? The fact that we've been so intricately created that everyone has to conclude, you have to conclude that there's something outside of us that has actually created us. And that may be something you disagree with, and that's okay. I mean, this is why we have these discussions. That's why we're talking about this particular question, because we know that there are a lot of people who may disagree with this particular premise that God actually created us. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus or not, I think you have to wrestle with this question. You have to wrestle with this question of whether or not science disproves faith, or if science and faith actually go together. You know, what you know about the Bible, what you know about life, I mean, this is something you really have to wrestle with. You know, there was a poll done, a survey done some years ago, and this was particularly to followers of Jesus, and they found that about 60% of these people who were surveyed believe that there was some incompatibility between faith and science, that there are some major issues or major areas in which faith and science actually disagree. But why would someone think that there is this tension? Why would they think that there is this, faith versus science or science versus faith? Why would they think that tension is actually there? I think for a skeptic or someone who is agnostic or atheist, who comes from the scientific sort of worldview, and I don't necessarily mean scientist per se, but from a scientific sort of worldview for their whole understanding about life, they tend to go back to the beginnings of science. It seems to be that they sort of rest their case on the fact that science was persecuted early on. And one example that they often cite is Galileo. Now, Galileo is famous for his theory that the world revolved around the sun, and heliocentrism. And the story goes, the way a skeptic would say it, or someone who's an atheist would say it, they would say that, well, he was tortured, he was beaten, he was heavily persecuted for his views on science. And that faith, or the Catholic Church, was always against science from the beginning. The problem with that is that story is simply untrue. Now, Galileo was a Christian. He actually was a believer in God. Maybe if he wasn't a devout follower of God, he believed, and what informed his science was the belief in God, that God was out there, right? That God created this universe. So that was the idea that he did all of his science behind, and that goes along with Newton, Kepler, and a bunch of other famous scientists. The idea that God existed, right, was the main sort of thrust behind everything they did. And so for Galileo, sure, he was put under house arrest, but eventually he was released to someone in the Catholic Church and able to go back to his villa and able to do the science that he was always created and meant to do. So the story is simply untrue to say that someone like Galileo was heavily persecuted and tortured and beaten or seen as a martyr for intellectual freedom, when in fact he was then given the space to be able to practice his science. And so, for a skeptical person, I think that's why they see this tension. But for a follower of Jesus, I think we also see the tension there as well, or we create the tension ourselves when we ask the Bible to do something it was never meant to do. When we ask the Bible to be a science textbook when it wasn't intended to be a science textbook. If the Bible was to be a thing for science, we would imagine that when we open up Genesis chapter 1, the creation story, that it would tell us something about our anatomy. It would tell us something about our chemical makeup, but it doesn't say anything about those things. And so we get into trouble, or we create this tension. And I know there are different views on the creation story. Whether or not it was 6 or 7 literal days, or was it over millions of years, all of these other kinds of things, or that maybe it's actually trying to give us some science. I know there's different views on it, but I firmly believe that that was not God's intention, to give us some science of the Bible. Because what we've done is that we've created this science in the Bible, and if the science of the Bible disagrees with the science of the scientific community, we throw out the science of the scientific community, and we rest fully in the science of the Bible. And I think that's an incorrect way to do this. I think that's an incorrect view to take. And so we've got to really look at both of these things, science and faith. And we've got to make sure, I think they both go hand in hand, but we've got to make sure they kind of stay in their own lane. Right? When they go hand in hand, that's going to assume big time that they stay in their own lane. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know if you've ever gotten in trouble for not necessarily staying in your own lane, and like on the roads, like you kind of veer off into somebody else's lane and you get honked at or something. But being in your own lane in life, where you're doing something you were not meant to do. And I don't mean that in a purpose kind of way that, I went and spent several years in college or many years in college and I was never meant to do that and now I'm in a different profession. I don't mean that exactly either. But say you go into your home and you see that there's a plumbing issue. And so you decide, you know what, I'm going to be a plumber today and I'm going to look on YouTube. It shouldn't be that difficult, right? And so you get into the work and you make the problem worse than it was before, and then now you actually have to call a real plumber to come and fix the problem. Or maybe you're like me, who you think, well, maybe I'll be a mechanic today and I'll try to fix the sliding door on our van, and I get to working on it and end up making it worse than it was before, and I panic because now I'm going to have to spend probably hundreds of dollars to go get it to a dealership for them to actually fix the problem. Or thankfully I had my wife, who has smaller hands than I do, and was able to finagle her hand where it needed to be and fix the issue for me. Or, like me, thinking I'm a doctor. I do all this running, I have all these aches and pains, and so I spend all this money on new shoes or other sort of foam rollers or things that I can, sort of better myself with, instead of just paying the money to go and actually see an actual doctor so I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. And so I think there's a lot of times where we get ourselves in trouble more often than we want to because we're not staying in our own lane. And that's the same case here. Faith and science work well together when they stay in their own lane, because when they stay in their own lane, they give us a good picture of how God created the world and how intricately we've created. So it gives us a better background into God's creative work in us. Now, what I find in conversations like this is that I think we often see, some people in faith, they have their moments where they do use faith to sort of debunk science. And then I think we see it from the other side as well for people in the scientific community, whether they're atheists or they're actually scientists, where they come against faith or they use science to attack faith. And so I think we see it from both ends. But I think more often I see it from the other side, from people who use science to attack faith. And some of the things you'll hear people say are things like this. They'll say science has knocked down arguments against God. And the findings of science imply that religions are factually mistaken. Science concludes that there's no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. What I find interesting about these particular quotes is that they use a lot of words here that you don't often find in science. Talk about this idea of God, right? You talk about that religions are factually mistaken. or that science concludes that there's no design, no evil, no good. All of these things are solved within the context of existential questions. And these existential questions of why or who, science is unable to answer them. And there are scientists all over the United States and even the world who would say to that very point that science cannot answer these questions, but indeed science can answer a lot of questions about this world, right? Maybe how it came to be or what we actually are. But it's unable to go into the lane that only things of faith, only things of spiritual things can actually answer. Now the truth is that you can be a person of faith and believe in science. You can be a person of science or a person in the scientific community, a scientist themselves, or maybe you're agnostic and have this kind of question and you believe firmly in science, that you can believe in that and also believe 100% in faith as well. But again, our culture has made us think, and people around us have made us think that we can't do that, that they are incompatible with one another. And now I think you find that they are compatible with one another once you really determine what kind of science we're actually talking about. Now I think if we talk about science from an atheistic point of view, I think that's where we get into trouble. That's where we find that there is this tension between faith and science. Because I don't think, and there are a lot of scientists that would back this up, that would say that that they are compatible with each other, that there's really no issue there, as long as they stay in their own lane. But a lot of people, a lot of atheists have used science to attack faith. So again, what we have to do is we have to run these two worldviews, right? If they're in disagreement with each other somehow, we've got to run them through a series of questions to figure out like what it is that we actually need to believe, right? Are they actually against each other or do they actually work together? And so the first question we ask is, am I accidental or am I designed? This is again another critical question that we have to ask, and this is something we talked about last time. That we look around our world and I think we have to conclude that something designed this. But you see, in our culture, we don't want to say that the universe has been designed by somebody. We don't want to say that humans have been designed by somebody. But we can go around town, we can go to a sports store, we can go to the grocery store, we can go wherever, and we assume that somebody designed whatever it is that we're buying. It's a bike, or maybe it's a motorcycle, whatever the case might be. Someone designed that. But we won't say that humans, even though we've been intricately created, able to solve complex problems with complex solutions, and the only thing in all of creation that has the mind that we do, and yet we're not able to say that we have been designed. Many atheists will say that we are just a product of blind, random forces. But I don't think that is sufficient to solve this, that inner question of like why it is that I'm here, or who am I? We have to look at something outside of us. So that's the question that we ask. Am I accidental or am I designed? And I think the Bible's clear, and I am a firm believer in this, that we have been designed. Does my life mean anything? Is another question, another critical question that we then ask. I don't know if you've ever seen this show before. This is House. I'm sure if you're a doctor of some sort or you work in the medical field, maybe you've seen this show before. And in this particular show, House is a really interesting sort of character. He's sometimes a very compassionate person, sometimes he's a really sarcastic kind of person, and sometimes he's a nice guy, sometimes he's not such a nice guy. But in this particular episode, a woman sort of finagled her way and kind of tricked him into caring for her in some sort of way. And, he, in a sarcastic sort of tone, turned to her and told her, he says, "I think you just figured out you're mortal, just a bag of cells and waste with an expiration date." I think this summarizes for us one of the prevalent sort of mindsets and worldview of our culture, and this is the worldview of nihilism. And in this particular worldview, you get to a point in life where nothing means anything. Right? Everything in our world is pointless. You just kind of are born, kind of do your thing in the rat race of life, And then at some point, you'll die. You're just a bag of cells and waste with an expiration date. Now, several years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and then again about 8 or 9 months ago, we had our daughters. And if a scientist were to sit there and look at these births and kind of write down anything special, they'd have nothing written on their paper. Now, yeah, they were special and miraculous to us, but generally speaking, there's nothing special about it. It was just like any other normal birth. And maybe you could conclude that, yes, these humans that are coming out, yeah, they are just a bag of cells and waste with an expiration date. Yes, eventually they will die. But you see, when these girls came out, we realized this is the truth, right? We realized this is a fact of life. This is going to happen. That's what they are. But the great thing about what Christianity tells us, what faith tells us, is that they're not just that. And I could see that when our daughters were born. They weren't just this. That they actually had been created and shaped and molded by God. So she wasn't just that. She was more than that. The Bible tells us that we are actually dust. Genesis 3:19 tells us, "For dust you are, and to dust you will return." But you see, in the Bible, we're not just dust. We're more than dust. We've been dust. We're dust that has been imbued with the Spirit of God. That in all of creation, the only thing that has been given this breath of God, the only thing in all of creation that God breathed life into was humans. And that's a very special place to be. So because of that, we have been given such value, such purpose in life, because God has given it to us. And so science for us in this particular question, if we take it to its end, if we try to get it to answer the why and the who question that we all ask, we can only conclude what House says, that we are just a bag of cells and waste with an expiration date. But faith gives us a more complete picture and says, no, you're not just that. You're dust. And you're not just dust, but you are dust that has been given the Spirit of God, the very breath and life of God in us to be put on this earth. Given purpose and value because of God. And so then that goes to the next question that we ask. Do I actually have value? Do I have value in this life? Now, everything in our world has value. Whether that's your things, whether it's your actual money that has value, our time and our energy, it all has value. But even people have value. If we take science as the ultimate worldview, science telling us who it is that we are, why it is that we are, or that if we actually have value, the only thing we can say is that, well, we're basically the same as every other animal, because we're all a part of the same evolutionary process, and so we're really no different. But yet, in the language in which we talk about humans, is that humans should be valued more than anything else that has been created. But on what grounds can we say that? On what grounds can we say that humans should be valued beyond or above any other created thing? Like, why should they be valued? And I don't think science is able to actually answer that question of why we should value humans above anything else. And that's where faith comes in. Because faith tells us this. It says, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. So the reason people have value is because something outside of us gave it to us. So for followers of Jesus, we believe that everybody has value. Right? There's nothing about who you are, what you look like, your personality, your characteristics. Those things don't determine your value. God determines your value. And that's why we look at all people, no matter what kind of background they have. We say, no, you have value. Not because I say you do, because someone objective outside of us says that you do. So if we take science to its end, right, your value is ultimately going to be determined by what's best for the survival of our species. But if we go to faith, giving us a complete picture, telling us that your value is not determined or dependent on anything else, but on God himself. And he says that we are highly valued in life. Now, we have to look at faith and science and take this journey sort of honestly and humbly. We have to determine, like, if we are going to take science as a complete worldview, we got to be willing to accept everything that it's going to tell us about who we are. But if we bring faith into the picture, I don't think there's any problem with that. There are many scientists that would agree to that same point and say that faith actually gives us a full rounded picture of who it is that we are, what our universe actually is. So one person who says that understanding more of science doesn't make God smaller, it allows us to see his creative activity in more detail. So I think when we put faith and science together, what we find is that faith, our faith, is actually enriched a lot more. And I think when we take faith and we bring science into the picture and allow science and faith to stay in their own lanes, right, working together with each other, not opposed to each other, what we find is that we're given, right, a far deeper picture of the fact that God has created us so intricately and has put so much value in us. So faith and science, I mean, if that's a particular sort of obstacle for you, you think that science has completely, done away with faith, I encourage you to go and actually do your own research, to go and see that they're actually very compatible with one another. If you're on the flip side and say, no, I trust in my faith, and there's a lot of science out there that disagrees with my faith, and you might be right. There's some places in which, yes, there might be some disagreement. But so long as God is at the center of our faith and God is at the center of science, they're compatible with each other. They can work together. So long as they do what they're supposed to do, and we ask science to do what it's meant to do, and we ask faith to do what it's meant to do. And if we do that, it deepens the truth further of how intricately God has made us. Let's pray. Well, God, thank you so much for your word, for how much you care for us, how much you love us. Thank you that you kind of been working through this entire series of these big questions that we've been wrestling with. And even for today, Lord, thank you for giving me the ability to get through this topic. And this is a very sort of weighty and heady topic that we're dealing with today. And so I thank you, Lord, that you have given me even some clarity as I was speaking today on this particular issue. And I pray that for anyone listening, that you give them some clarity on this issue as well. That you help them to see that faith and science actually work well together. They're not opposed to each other, so long as they do what they're meant to do. That we allow them to do what they're meant to do and not make them do something that is against what you've intended or is against what the scientific community intends for their particular disciplines. So Lord, help us to kind of work through this issue, if that's still an issue for us. Help us, Lord, to take this journey seriously and to really look around us and see how science really informs a lot of our faith, and that faith informs a lot of our science. So we thank you, Lord, that you've created us. You've created us the way that we are. Thank you for your word. Thank you for this time. In Jesus' name, amen.